Thanks so much, and welcome everyone to Harvard. It's really a delight to have you all here. So I'm going to talk today about how we can use the tools of big data to make changes in our local communities and our own institutions to improve economic opportunity. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which is of course a multifaceted, complex concept that means different things to different people. But I want to distill it to a simple statistic that my colleagues and I set about to measure a few years ago, which is a child's chances of going on to earn more than their parents did, a traditional cornerstone of what the American dream is all about. So many people have the view that America is a country where through hard work, anyone can rise up in the income distribution relative to their parents. And so in this first chart here, my colleagues and I set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration, both historically and today. So what you're looking at here is the fraction of kids who go on to earn more than their parents did by the year in which the child was born. So if you look at the far left side of this chart, you can see that for kids born back in the middle of the last century, back in 1940, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. If you look at what has happened over time, you can see a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the middle of the 1980s, for whom we're measuring their incomes around age 30 today, it's now become only a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. The American dream has become a coin flip. Now, this broad trend is of great interest to economists like myself. It reflects a fundamental change in the American economy. I would argue it's also a fundamental social and political interest, because I think it's this very trend that reflects a lot of the frustration that people around America are expressing as reflected in political outcomes. So motivated by this trend, in our research and policy group here at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, we're focused on the big question of what is driving the fading of the American dream and how can we restore the American dream going forward. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you a little bit about how we're studying that issue and trying to make change on the ground through policy interventions. And that's going to illustrate, I think more broadly, a fundamental change in the social sciences, of which Harvard is really at the vanguard, which is studying these questions with the tools of modern data science, using much larger data sets, granular precision that we never had before. So to illustrate that, let me turn to this map here, which shows you the geography of opportunity within the United States. I'll first describe how we construct this map, and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we're looking at here is a map constructed using data on 20 million kids drawn from anonymized tax returns, essentially all kids born in the early 1980s in the United States. And we are dividing the US into 740 different metro and rural areas, and in each of those areas computing a simple measure of upward mobility. What is the average income around age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families, families at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, that is families making about $27,000 a year. We color the map so that red colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility, where if you grow up in a poor family, you're less likely to escape poverty. And blue-green colors, like you can see in much of the center of the country, represent areas where you're more likely to rise up, where you have much higher rates of upward mobility. Now, if you just look at the scale on the lower right side, or the numbers that you see on this chart, you can see that there are vast differences in kids' chances of rising up in different parts of the US. In places like Dubuque, Iowa, kids who grow up in low-income families, have substantially higher incomes than their parents did a generation ago. But kids growing up in families at the exact same income level in Charlotte, North Carolina, actually have lower incomes on average than their parents did 30 years earlier, despite the fact that Charlotte is one of the most rapidly growing cities in the US. So this map, I think, is of great interest to social scientists and to policymakers, because if we can figure out what is driving this sharp variation in rates of upward economic mobility across different areas, maybe we can then figure out how we change policies to increase upward mobility throughout the US and create more places like the central Midwest, places like Dubuque, and so forth. So motivated by that, in the next couple of minutes here, I'm going to talk about a series of explanations for what might drive the variation that we're seeing in this map. You might already have some hypotheses in your mind. So to give you one example, economists will often think of the possibility that there are different types of jobs available in different areas. Maybe places with a strong tech sector give you more chances to rise up. But when we dig deeper and look at that data, we actually see that that doesn't seem to be what's going on. The example I gave you, for instance, of Charlotte, North Carolina, that's a booming city where there are lots of firms creating new jobs. But despite that, as you can see here, the kids growing up in low-income families in Charlotte don't actually have great opportunities. They're not getting those high-paying jobs. So what is actually going on? So one explanation that might come to some of your minds, anyone familiar with the demography of the US would recognize that there's potentially a connection to race here. The places with larger African-American populations, places like Cincinnati, Detroit, Cleveland, much of the Southeast, they also tend to be the ones in the red and orange colors in this map, right? And we all know that there's a long history of racial disparities in the United States. So it may not surprise you to know that there are lower rates of economic mobility for Black Americans than white Americans, and maybe that's what's driving some of the variation that we're seeing in this map. So the next step in our analysis was to take the data from tax returns and link that to census data covering every American in order to be able to draw this pair of maps here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility, the same statistics that I was showing you before, separately for Black men on the left and white men on the right. Now, when you first look at these two maps, you might think, oh, they've put these maps on two different color scales, kind of a red-orange color scale on the left and a blue-green color scale on the right. But in fact, if you look at the bottom of this slide, you can see that we have not. The maps are on exactly the same color scale. It's just that there is such an extreme difference in rates of economic opportunity between Black men and white men that it's almost like you have two different countries. To put it a bit more precisely, the very best places for upward mobility for Black men, a place like Boston, for example, where Black men growing up in low-income families go on to earn about $25,000 a year, they have lower rates of upward mobility than the very worst places for upward mobility for white men, a place like Charlotte, North Carolina. So there's no understating the importance of race in America even today, even conditional on class. Prospects for upward mobility vary dramatically between Black and white Americans, an issue we obviously need to tackle going forward. Now, you'll notice that I showed you the data here specifically for men, and I did that for a very particular reason. If I now show you the exact same pair of maps for women, you see a strikingly different pattern. Black women and white women have basically the same rates of economic mobility. There isn't that much of a difference. So the racial disparities that we see in the US, what we learned from this analysis, really are driven by limited opportunities for Black men to rise up. And that makes you think about a certain set of explanations that might be related to mass incarceration, the criminal justice system, discrimination that affects Black men in particular, and so forth. Now, I've shown you here that race seems to be important in understanding what's going on, but if you look, for instance, at the map for white women on the right side, you can see that there's still a lot of variation, even among white women and their prospects for upward mobility across different areas. So race matters, but so does place. There's still big differences across different parts of the country. So to understand a little bit better what is driving that, I'm gonna toggle over here to this tool on the internet called the Opportunity Atlas, where I'm gonna start by showing you the same statistics that I was showing you at the national level. But the way this tool works, and you can access this yourself, is very much like a Google map. You can basically type in an address and literally zoom in to look at these data now at a much more granular level. So I'm just gonna pick New York City for illustration. You can type in your own home address. And what we're doing now is looking at these data at a much more granular level. Sorry about that. Where we're looking at the data census tract by census tract. So basically neighborhood by neighborhood in New York City, broken into groups of 4,000 people each. And what you can see here is when you look at this map for New York City, you can go from the deepest reds to the darkest blues, just driving a couple miles down the road in New York. So what is that telling you? It's like you can go from Alabama to Iowa in terms of your rates of upward mobility, your chances of rising up, living in one part of New York versus another part of New York. Now, we see this not just in New York, we see this pattern in cities across America. And so what that's teaching us is that the roots of economic opportunity are incredibly granular. It's about the exact neighborhood you live in, not living in this state or that state, this region or that region. Okay, so next step, coming back here to the slides. Let me just do this again. So, you might wonder, what is it that's driving the variation that I've been showing you nationally, very locally, across different neighborhoods in New York? So there's a lot of analysis that's been done over the years trying to understand what's driving these differences across neighborhoods. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, briefly summarize some of the strongest predictors of these differences in upward mobility that we find. Places with higher rates of upward mobility tend to have lower poverty rates. They tend to be more mixed income neighborhoods. They tend to have more stable family structures, more two-parent families. They tend to have, as you might expect intuitively, better schools. And they tend to have greater social capital. By that we mean more tightly knit networks, more connections between, say, high-income and low-income people living in a given area. Okay, so in the last minute here, I want to wrap up by talking about how we can take these research findings outside the halls of Harvard to actually make a difference in people's lives on the ground, which I think is very important to all of us and something you will learn more about here if you take social science classes at Harvard. So if you think about the data I've been showing you, I think they really point to 3 different approaches that you might think about to increase upward mobility. The first is to reduce segregation in our cities, give more low-income families access to the types of neighborhoods and schools that are going to help their kids rise up. The second is to make place-based investments, that is, actually try to figure out how you turn the red-colored places into the blue-green colored places through strategic improvements in schools or other neighborhood conditions. And the third is to figure out how we can make colleges like Harvard and other higher education institutions around the US contribute more to social mobility by giving more low-income kids access to colleges like this, where we see terrific outcomes. So I'm not going to go into the details on that here, just in the interest of time, but what I will leave you with is telling you a bit about how this kind of research can actually have an impact going forward. So in the context of the work that we've been doing on helping families move to higher opportunity areas, there's been new legislation in Congress basically providing housing vouchers to more families to move to more of those blue-green colored neighborhoods that I was showing you through rental assistance programs and counseling for families that we see in the data can really meaningfully change kids' lives and is now probably going to have a scale impact with billions of dollars being allocated by Congress to change the way we do affordable housing in the United States. And if you're interested in learning more about the issues that I've been talking about here, let me invite you, if you come to Harvard, which we very much hope you do, to take Economics 50, taught right here in Sanders Theater. I'll be teaching here tomorrow, in fact, on these kinds of issues where we basically give students an introduction to modern applied economics with no prereqs. This is a class you can take as freshmen. And we touch on topics that we see as being very relevant to society today, like equality of opportunity, as I was just talking about, education, health, climate change, criminal justice, tax policy, and so forth. And while you learn about those topics, you learn about many methods in modern data science, like regression analysis, causal inference, quasi-experimental methods, machine learning, and so forth, all tools that we hope will serve you in whatever career paths you'll pursue down the road. So thanks very much, and hoping to see many of you in the years to come.